Hello and welcome to the one-year anniversary edition of Money Reimagined, or as my co-host Sheila Warren has taken to calling it, our Podiversary. For this super-duper extra special edition, landing 1 year after we launched Money Reimagined, we're bringing back a pair of guests that nature had always clearly intended should be in the same podcast recording together. Raoul Pal, the CEO of Real Vision, and an articulate analyst of crypto's place in the investing and broader macro environment, and Jill Carlson, the founder of the Open Money Initiative, which is working on improving money for society at large, especially for financially excluded people in poorer parts of the world. Back in December last year, we brought Raoul and Jill onto the show to foster something of a debate, though that's possibly too strong a word for what emerged from that discussion. They addressed what we described in our show notes at the time as a battle for Bitcoin's soul. The talk then was all about the institutional money lining up to invest in Bitcoin. And the questions we were asking was whether this large investor group, the kind that Raoul talks to regularly, was counterproductive to the mission that people like Jill have set in delivering cryptocurrency solutions to the masses. Our guests disagreed on some stuff, but they also found a lot of middle ground. Now, 10 months later, Bitcoin is 4 times what it was back then in terms of price, although it's well down from the $65,000 high it soared to after institutional and corporate investors piled in the early months of 2021. The rollercoaster ride since then has included some dramatic developments, such as a crackdown in China and a new regulatory push in the US under new President Joe Biden's choice to lead the Securities and Exchange Commission, Gary Gensler. We've had companies like Tesla come in and then pull out of Bitcoin as concerns grew over its environmental impact. We've had the country of El Salvador make it legal tender. And on the Ethereum side, we've seen some tremendous new innovation in fields such as NFTs and DeFi, as well as an explosion of new layer 1 protocols to compete with Ethereum. Jill and Raoul will help us put that past year into perspective. But before they do, let's welcome my co-host, Sheila Warren. Hey, Sheila.
Hey, Michael. So what a year it's been.
Yes, quite a year. A lot of fun, a lot of chaos, a lot of craziness, but that's sort of par for the course in this sector. I'm wondering whether your podiversary term now is something that's going to take off.
Happy podiversary.
Yes,
I'm just going to know of the two of us, I'm the one that makes the dad joke. So, there you have it.
Yeah, that is a bit of a dad joke. Yeah, I got to admit. But it's been fun, Sheila. It really has been a wild, fun ride with you. So thank you for being on the journey with me. On that note, since we've got a tight show today, let's bring in our guests. So let's say hello to Jill and Raoul. Hi, guys.
Hi, guys. Good to see you.
Hey,
welcome
back. I mean, no shortage of things to talk about if we do a year recap, right? The question's more like, where do we begin? No shortage of content.
Indeed.
Why don't we start with that then, guys? I mean, each of you, give us a sense of what you think has been the most important development in the past 12 months. So, Jill, leave it to you first.
Starting with a very small question, aren't you there, Michael? What is the most important development of the last 12 months? Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think that for me, if I was to choose one, it would be just the influx of institutions, which, is kind of interesting. The fact that the last time that Raoul and I were on the show, that was the topic that we were talking about. And at the time, it was more sort of in theory, is this now the moment that we're finally going to see financial institutions, corporates, what have you, enter the space? And indeed, over the last year, we have, whether that's investment institutions looking to not only now invest in the likes of Bitcoin, but also Ethereum and other tokens, but also even extending into the DeFi space and looking to get more active with those products. And then also, you mentioned in the lead into the show here today, the likes of Tesla, things that we haven't mentioned yet, the likes of PayPal and Visa and so forth. And I think that if you had asked me a year ago or even 3 years ago, would we see the sort of institutional activity that we see in the